October 19th, 2020. So I've had several requests asking about how I set up my greenhouse, what things to look out for, basically looking for some general tips and techniques for setting up a greenhouse. So here we are looking at my greenhouse. This is 24 feet long by 12 feet wide. I modeled this based on a model that a friend of mine gave me for a 12 by 12 greenhouse and doubled it. The reason I doubled it right off the bat was because I got reading up on greenhouses, and everybody said if you think you need a greenhouse of a certain size, double that. And they were right. I would have quadrupled it or even more had I known how fast things were going to grow and how much more space I would actually want. But I should mention, I did build this greenhouse strictly as a test greenhouse. I did not expect this to last more than a couple of years. It's lasted 6 so far, which is awesome. And the frame is still pretty solid. It does need to be re-plasticked at some point. We're overdue for changing the plastic. I do have some glass. I thought about putting glass in it. I don't know. I don't own the land here, so I don't want to get too involved or do something that upsets the landlords. So for now, it is what it is. It still works great, even despite how opaque and how little light is coming through the plastic at this point. It still does a pretty good job. So like I said, I was going to do a video on this, but the more I got thinking about this and pondering greenhouses and all the logistics of it, I decided I'm going to do a series on greenhouses and setting up your own greenhouse, because I don't want to turn this into a 4-hour video. So I'm going to do this in a series. Today we'll start with some of the basics about greenhouses. I guess I should provide a little background here. So I'll try to dig up an old pic from this end of the greenhouse, because when I first designed this greenhouse, it actually had an in-ground furnace. Something I'd always wanted to try was an in-ground furnace. Another thing I always wanted to try was a greenhouse, and so I decided to combine the two. So originally this had a furnace in the ground about 4 feet. It was really basically a rocket stove. I did not have money to buy quality steel material, so I made it out of scrap metal that I had around here, much thinner than I would have preferred, but I really just wanted to test the idea and see whether it was effective and worked or not. So that furnace was a rocket furnace set in the ground and had a heat riser coming out of it, and then off the heat riser all the exhaust went around the entire underside of the greenhouse and came back out this end. I guess I'll show you where the old exhaust pipe came out, right here. And yes, that is dryer hose, and no, that wasn't a problem because I was taking all the heat that furnace was producing. I was taking that off in the soil, in the furnace, and in the heat riser, and I had a couple of steel leaders coming out before it switched over to that stuff. Only reason I used that stuff was because it was inexpensive. In order to make it so that it wouldn't collapse, I lined that whole thing with vertical 2x6 that I had laying around to keep it from crushing down, so it would maintain its shape. And then that whole thing was built into adobe under the greenhouse, and the greenhouse was built on top of that. That worked pretty well. I think I ran 2 years on that, actually, which is 1 year more than I expected. But it did eventually start to rot out, and rather than get halfway through a heating season and have it break down and not be able to heat the greenhouse, I opted to switch out and put a wood stove in. That's worked okay. The original stove was a hand-me-down that I got from a good friend of mine. It was his mother's, actually. That stove worked pretty well, but it was a little bit awkward for different wood sizes and stuff. I think it was 2 years ago, my good friend John bought me the stove that's in the greenhouse as a Christmas gift. That was very generous of him, and actually that was supposed to be for my inside place, but my living situation changed and I ended up moving it into the greenhouse. That stove has worked out really well. Obviously, being that the stove is now above ground, we can't be producing the heat into the soil. There's definitely some things I would have done differently about that. One is I would definitely go down at least 2 feet on the bottom edges all the way around to the greenhouse. And I do this for any greenhouse here forward. Here in the northern states, or if you have a cold climate, one of the biggest places you'll find that cold creeps in, and one of the most detrimental things to plant health and vitality is in the wintertime. That cold creeps in the soil, and it makes the roots of those plants cold, even if they're in pots. And sometimes even if they're up on insulation, those roots get really cold, and that slows their growth down tremendously. So one tip I would say, if you're building a greenhouse, go down at least 2 feet, 4 feet if you can afford to do the excavation work, and insulate the edges on the outside where the walls of the greenhouse come down to the soil. Prevent that cold from infiltrating in. That's a #1 tip for good greenhouse health and performance. So what we'll do now is go inside. We'll talk a little bit more about the system that was here, and then we'll go into some of the more specifics about tips and techniques for greenhouses. So here we are in the greenhouse, and I just want to say there is a lot of information in my head that I would like to share with you, but I want to share it in a way that you can use it efficiently and effectively. So what I'll do is carry on from where we were outside. I'll just show you briefly where the old furnace was. It was a 4-foot long box set 4 feet down by 15 inches by 15 inches, and it came out into this riser. Inside that riser there was another pipe with a notch cut in one side of it. What that does is cause the exhaust gas coming out of the furnace to come into that pipe at an angle and starts it spinning, and that gives you a vortex coming up. That's your most efficient transfer of energy, and it also, in that vortex, it distributes that heat to the outside of this riser. So we'll come up that riser, it'll come up the inside of that pipe spinning, hit this riser here, and then spin back down the outside and then out the exhaust and into the channels that I talked about that were in ground. So this riser, when that furnace was running, would glow orange, and so obviously I'd have to keep plants away from it. You get away from it like 6 inches or so, and it wasn't even, it wasn't even hot to hold your hand, like back a ways. But that riser basically had a piece of copper on the top, and the copper acted as a catalyst to help burn off remaining exhaust gases, and I had a way to add extra air coming in from the furnace so you could support burning off those exhaust gases with a little extra oxygen. That makes a huge difference in the efficiency of the furnace. And actually, my goal eventually was, and at some point in the future probably will still be, to take that gas from the furnace after it's cooled, because when it comes out the other end it's cold, it's room temp or cooler, and that gas is something that's called syngas. If you have the correct type of burn in the furnace, you produce what's called syngas, and that's a burnable fuel, and you can run a generator or another heating system or whatever. I actually did have success just playing around with it and actually getting that gas to light off. I'll see if I can dig up a clip. I don't know, I might have lost that hard drive.
There you go. There's a flash. Wind's gonna screw me up. Yeah, you can see it a little bit. There you go. There you go. There you go. Not great. Not as good as I had before. Didn't have as much wind before. But you can definitely see it. That flame just shoot up along the edge where the oxygen can get to the gas.
But if I can dig up a clip, I'll show you a clip of me lighting that gas off. It bursts into this beautiful blue flame. So if you're not familiar with wood gasification as a fuel, that's a really interesting topic all in itself. So ultimately I'd like to run a wood stove or in-ground furnace or rocket stove, something like that, and then take that syngas and run the generator to produce extra power for the greenhouse. And then you'd have a heat source and a power source. The power source could provide supplemental lighting, and we'll get into supplemental lighting with the greenhouse at some point in this series. I'm not going to touch on it in this video because I don't want to get carried away too much. Well, I may touch on it, but I won't go into great depth on it. I guess real quick I'll just show, even though it's a cloudy day, all the power for the Raspberry Pi is coming from the solar panel, and we're actually charging that battery bank. We were down at 12.2 volts last night, actually 12.15 when I walked out of here, and now we're sitting back at 12.6. So that's nice to see this battery's taking a charge, and it's nice to be back on the solar power. So I don't have the sensors fixed yet on the Raspberry Pi, but we do have the DC power system back, and so the vents open and close now. I just sent the command to open these vents because it's pretty warm in here. It's a cloudy day, but you'd be surprised how much heat you can actually collect even on a cloudy day, especially when you accumulate that in combination with all the thermal mass that you've created overnight. This pot is probably, it's probably 120 degrees, maybe 125. It's pretty warm. So that brings me to my next point. Greenhouses effectively are trying to mimic a natural environment, and in trying to mimic that natural environment, you're trying to provide plant comfort. That's really the end goal for a greenhouse, is to provide comfort for plants. And I think that's a perspective that you should adopt for anything you're growing. And it's a huge part of regenerative agriculture, providing adequate mineral nutrition and biology and comfort for plants. When you can put a plant in its optimal environment, it can express its genetics at an optimal rate, and that will give you optimal yield. So what we're trying to do in a greenhouse is mimic an environment that is where the plants that we're growing comes from. So in the example of ginger, for example, this is all ginger here. Ginger is a tropical plant. There are non-tropical versions of ginger, but this is a tropical version of ginger, and so it grows in the under canopy of rainforest in its natural environment. So what we're trying to mimic is the under canopy of rainforest. So that said, in order to do that, you'd want high humidity, you'd want warm temperatures, and you'd want good soil moisture and good humic matter. So the challenge becomes, if you're in a northern climate like I am, I'm here at 42 north latitude in Tivoli, New York. That's upstate New York, or relatively upstate. Upstate from the city. It is not New York City. So for those of you who don't realize that there's other parts of New York besides the city, there's a lot of rural country in New York. And so we have some pretty extreme cold winters here. We can get down to negative temperatures here. I personally have seen temperatures of negative 15 before. I think even -20 when I was a kid. Those aren't very common. Usually 0 is about our lowest temperature, although we do sometimes see -5. A couple of years ago we had a stretch of maybe 2 or 3 weeks where we were down -5 all night, and I don't think we touched much over 25 during the daytime. So, so obviously that's not a very friendly environment for growing plants. So, so you end up trying to straddle this management of environments, and really the more critical times a year, in addition to the really cold temperatures where you have to provide lots of heat, and I guess I'll just stop here and mention that this is greenhouse plastic. This is 6 mil plastic. It's actually double layered. I did have it spaced, but I didn't have the budget to get all the stuff that I need to do to make really nice spacing. So there are places where the 2 layers have collapsed together a little bit. But there's a huge difference between single layer and double layer plastic. If you can do double layer, do it. If you can do glass, that's even nicer. You get much better light transmittance with glass. But this greenhouse plastic is supposed to be 97% light transmission, which is pretty darn good for plastic. It's also UV and infrared resistant. And the UV is critical, because if you use regular plastic and you think that's going to last, you're going to be really disappointed when it breaks down in the sunlight, which it's going to be exposed to all day, every day, and starts shredding and tearing, and all of a sudden your plastic comes off your greenhouse and now all your plants freeze. So if you're going to do plastic, get the greenhouse plastic. The best place that I've found for pricing for that is a place called littlegreenhouse.com. They carry all sorts of greenhouse stuff. They carry greenhouse kits. They carry just greenhouse plastic if you want to build your own frame like I did here. And they carry, you know, horticultural lighting, timers, all that sort of stuff. Pretty good on pricing. Their shipping's very fast. Their return policy is great. I really like them. They really took care of me, and so so that's why I'm sharing their information. Anyway, in the springtime and the fall time, those are really the hardest times for a greenhouse. That's the time when you have cold nights, often below freezing here. You know, we'll get frost here. We had frost here 2 nights ago. I think we were down to like 30 degrees or maybe 28. And then in the daytime, you know, you can go up to 60, 70, even sometimes 80 or 90 degrees. We've had 90 degrees in March here, where you get a night where it's 20 degrees overnight and 90 in the daytime. You know, that's a huge extreme to manage. And so managing that extreme is really where it comes out to. So on the overnights, you have to have good heat. You can do that by retaining heat from daytime in the form of thermal mass. Water is one of the most efficient ways to do that. And the advantage of water is you can take tanks like these, you can fill them and use them for thermal mass management, and then you know, if you want to get them out of the way or move them or relocate them or reconfigure them, you just drain the tank, and then the tank is light to move. You can use concrete, you can use rock, you can use soil. There's all sorts of things, but water has a specific heat of 1.0, and if you compare that to concrete at a specific heat of 0.5, that means you need double the cubic footage of concrete that you do of water to retain the same amount of thermal energy. So keep that in mind when you're designing a greenhouse. I'll pause here for a sec. Hashtag save the honeybee. That's better, huh, sweetheart? How'd you get yourself in there? Hmm? Poor thing, you were going to drown in there. Look at her, isn't she beautiful? Alright, back to greenhouses. Okay, so those are the 2 biggest extremes you need to manage. That cooling and heating thing is really tricky. You could be heating overnight, and then as soon as the sun hits the greenhouse, you're going to have to be ready to open vents and provide ventilation. In that process, you don't want to let air in that's too cold, because you can shock plants with that. So it becomes a very tricky balance. Now, how have I managed that in my greenhouse? Well, Initially, I was just opening the doors. Both of these doors opened back in the day. This one I've since sealed off. I just don't use it, and I don't need it open. And my wood stove is right there, so I'm trying to prevent airflow in and out of there, so I just sealed that off. But I used to open both the doors, and that meant having to run out here by 9 or 10 in the morning, get these doors open, and even at 9 or 10 in the morning on a spring day or a fall day, it would be pretty hot in here already. You'd see 105, 110 degrees. Obviously, that's not ideal for plants. So over time, I developed the Greenhouse Raspberry Pi controller for the specific purpose of managing the thermal mass system, monitoring temperatures, data logging those temperatures, and controlling ventilation and all of those other little subtle factors to automate it. Eventually that system would be upgraded. That's going to be a whole nother series that I'll do. Actually, I've started a series on Greenhouse Pi controller, so if you haven't seen that, check out Set Up Your Own Raspberry Pi. That's the playlist for setting up that equipment. And if you want to look at it from a more general perspective, check out my playlist, just Raspberry Pi. I'll throw links to those up in here so you can check them out. So, overnight, make heat or store heat and release heat. And then as the sun comes up, open the vents. Don't open them too early, because if you open them too early, you're letting cold air in that's too cold and you're shocking plants. So I have the greenhouse sensor set up so that the outside temperature sensor has to sense 50 degrees outside before the bottom vent opens. So this is my way of managing this. Now in a commercial greenhouse, you actually put an exterior room on the outside of your intake vent. Usually they use fans. I use passive ventilation. We'll talk about that at some point. Usually you would put a room outside of your intake vent, and that room is an air preheat room so that you're ventilating with air that isn't too cold. There's a greenhouse just down the road from me that has that set up. Maybe I'll try and get a video clip of that or a picture of that so you can kind of understand. But basically you put a barrier wall in between, and you have a cold air side in, and then your air has to circulate through that, and then it gets sucked into your greenhouse. So instead of having, say, 30-degree air coming into the greenhouse and going straight across the plants, that 30-degree air comes in, gets pre-warmed, and then it comes into the greenhouse as 50 or 60-degree air, so you're not shocking your plants. That's very critical. So the way I manage that is I open this vent. Anything below 40 degrees, I don't open any venting, and I found that hasn't been a problem in here. The maximum temperature we reach in here is about 85, 80, 85, sometimes 90 on a really sunny day when it's 40 degrees out. But once we get to above 40 degrees, I'll allow this upper vent to open to let off heat and not be pulling cold air in. It'll sort of slowly exchange through this upper vent and let the heat out the top. Keep in mind, heat rises. You can use that to your advantage, or you can work against it. I like to use natural systems to my advantage, and so I take full advantage of convection. That's that process, convection, and so I let the heat out with that. And then when we get above 50, if it's still too hot in here and the temperature reaches 85 or 90, I forget what the set point is, that's when we open the secondary vent and start really piping air through here. Now I don't need a fan to move air through here. These vents, you'll notice how big the space is for these vents. Each of these vents I think is, I think they're 3 foot by 7 foot, so 21 square foot of ventilation space. The greenhouse floor space in here is 288 square feet as a comparison. So you can see what that percentage is, and that's very critical. You need to be able to exchange a tremendous amount of air very quickly when you need to exchange air. So let's see, go on to the next point. Okay, so we talked about venting, we talked about plastic type. One of the other advantages to the greenhouse plastic is it has that infrared coating that's supposed to help reduce dew and condensation. So this is another thing that you have to manage in a greenhouse environment, is humidity. And it's really important, really, really important, again, for plant comfort and health. Okay, so plants, when humidity levels are friendly to the plant, Ideally, those humidity levels would be in the 50 to 60% range, could be as high as 70%. If it gets much below or much above that, plants have a really hard time opening their stomata and doing transpiration. And that's a huge part of a plant's growth. It needs to be able to pull moisture up from the soil into the stem, through the leaf, photosynthesize, and release that excess moisture through the stomata. For those who don't know, the stomata are these little holes in each plant leaf, and if you look at these on a microscopic level, they have little breathing holes, and they can open and close those, and they'll do that based on the environment that's around them. If it's too dry, they'll close their stomata and try to prevent moisture loss, and if it's too wet, they won't be able to evaporate moisture out. And so that will slow the photosynthetic process down, slow plant growth down, and you know if you're slowing photosynthesis and plant growth down, you're slowing productivity down. So that's another very important thing to manage. So in here, in the wintertime, with the wood stove running as a heat source, it gets very dry in here very quickly overnight. In the daytime when the sun comes out, it gets dry in here also because of that. So what I do is I come in here in the winter, I will water the plants that I'm watering. Sometimes I'll even spray the plants down for extra moisture, and I'll actually go through and I'll water this floor down pretty extensively to raise humidity in here to keep it up here. If I don't do that, humidity will typically fall below 30%. I've seen it down at 20, I've seen it down at 15% and even 10% on really cold winter nights when the stove is running hard. So managing humidity is tricky. Now in the daytime, if you've done that, or if you have a lot of growing plants in here and that sun comes out, they start growing, they start releasing all this moisture, the sun strikes the floor and the plants, all this moisture is coming out, and you'll see humidity spike way high in the daytime. And again, that's where that ventilation becomes very critical. Winter time I don't see that so much, but spring and fall I do. So that's another factor. Now, if you're growing tropical plants that are used to long light cycles or are from the equatorial region of the planet, you're going to need to use supplemental lighting. And we'll get into supplemental lighting. That's a whole separate topic that I want to cover because it may seem like a simple topic, but it is not a simple topic at all. And maybe what I'll do is get my friend Justin from Justin Good Earth YouTube channel. Maybe I'll get him on one of my Comrades and Farms shows, and we'll sort of dissect the whole supplemental lighting thing, because I know that we could have a 2-hour conversation about that and really draw out some of the more subtle details about that. But be prepared to supply supplemental lighting if you're planning on growing tropical plants. Doesn't matter if it's ginger, doesn't matter if it's cannabis, figs, and in general, most plants I find in my environment, here by December 31st, we get down to around 9 hours of sunlight a day. And it's 9 short hours, and it's a very low angle in the sky. It is not very beneficial for plant growth. And then you have to remember that you're taking loss through the plastic, or even if you have glass, you're taking loss through that. You're not getting all of that light through. So that's a very critical part of it. So be prepared for supplemental lighting. And also remember that even if you have single wall glass, even the double pane glass that's supposed to be super good at thermal retention, it's only rated at like R3.5 or something like that. It's a very low insulation value. And so, and the plastic too. So when you're heating against really cold weather, be prepared to provide a lot of heat. This stove here is easily capable of 100,000 BTUs per hour. And there are times in the winter when I'm pushing it to that. The advantage that I get out of the thermal mass, I can't even describe it to you, but I do have videos on it, and maybe I'll go back and dig one of those up and throw a link here for you on it. But it's really important to be able to produce a lot of heat quickly, store some of that heat, and then release it over time. As it is, I'm up till about 2 or 3 in the morning in the wintertime when it's really cold out, stoking the stove, making sure we're producing good heat, and then I can let the stove carry it out till about 8 or 9 a.m. when the sun starts to come up and warm things up again. But that's very critical. Let me see. So we covered all that. One thing that you'll almost certainly want is some sort of a data logging system or some sort of system for monitoring temperatures in the greenhouse. You can get all sorts of remote control thermometers and wireless weather sensors and that kind of stuff, but I find that they're ultimately lacking and unreliable, and that's part of why I started building the greenhouse Raspberry Pi controller. You can buy greenhouse controller systems. They are incredibly expensive. If you check out, say, NeverSync Farm on YouTube, his greenhouse controllers are commercial grade greenhouse controllers. They run about $3,000 for the controller, and every time you add a sensor, that's another $200 or $300. So unless you have a gigantic budget, count on building your own stuff or count on other ways to manage and monitor. Now, my greenhouse is about 300 feet from where I live, so for me it's quite a walk to come out here and check on things. Not that that's a huge distance, but in the snow and the cold, when there's a 30-mile-an-hour wind out there, it's a long ways to walk. So it's really handy to have this system set up here. This comes back through a 1 gigabit network connection right back to my console. It logs all the data to a database on here, and I chart that. And I've done other videos on that. Maybe I'll share a link to that too. But that's really handy for keeping an eye on things. And if the stove doesn't light up properly because a piece of wood is slow to light, or if a door gets yanked open or something happens, you can see that temperature change reflected on the chart right away. There's a problem and you can go mitigate it right away. It's really important. Alright, so this is a basic introduction to this series. What I'm going to do is post this video up. I'll let the people who are inquiring about the greenhouse stuff check it out and ask further questions, and then what I'll do is I'll write those questions down and I'll go into those pieces piece by piece. This will be a series. I also have lots more to talk about and discuss and explain, but I just wanted to get sort of an introductory starting video to this series to kind of help you better understand greenhouse environmental management. It's a lot more complex than you think it is, and even I used to bring in my rosemary and my olive and a few other tropical plants that I wanted to keep. I used to bring those inside and put high pressure sodium supplemental lighting over them for the winter. That power bill was not cheap, and so I wanted to get away from that and get to a greenhouse. I thought I would put the greenhouse in, put the thermal mass furnace in, and it would be relatively easy. I gotta tell you, it's a lot harder than you think it is in this environment here. Now, if you're in a more southern climate, it may be easier to manage, but you're also going to need to manage that venting a little more efficiently. So before you go out and build a greenhouse, definitely think about all these factors. It's really important. You don't want to go out and build something to be really disappointed that it doesn't protect your plants. So I would say if you do build a greenhouse, don't go put your most valuable and important plants in it right away. Do some tests on it. See how it performs. Find out how it handles those extreme temperatures. Make sure things are working correctly. If you don't, you're going to lose your plants, and well, I hate to see plants die because of mistakes. Anyway, that's the end of part 1 of this video series. I don't know how many videos this is going to take, but I know it's going to take a lot because there's a lot of complex information, and I want to cover it and convey it in a clear, concise way. I hope you found this interesting and informative. I hope I've talked about this clearly and concisely and haven't scattered around too much. If you have questions or comments, please do so down below. I'd love to hear back from you. I'd love to hear any further questions you have about this sort of stuff, and then I can use that information to gear my upcoming videos to really hit at what people are looking to find out and what they're looking for informationally. So I thank you for watching the Pharmacy Seeds Network, and I hope we'll see you in the next video. Don't forget, Tuesday nights, 9 p.m. Pacific, Wednesday, 12 a.m., Comrades and Farms on Truth Frequency Radio and here on the Pharmacy Seeds Network YouTube. Also streamed live on TalkStream Live, iHeart, and Tuned In. Alright, thanks for watching the Pharmacy Seeds Network.